Okay, for our first RtWebPart, we're going to look at the RtGauge WebPart. It is a WebPart that displays an analog style gauge. So this is a gauge that's basically got a pointer, points to whatever the current value is. That's our gauge. Now this gauge, it's only going to have one data point at a time. So that means that we're actually going to ignore the start time. If you ever need to change the timestamp on this, we'll use the end time. And there's going to be one gauge for each data point. Now, if I go over to here we go, we've got a live RtWebPart sitting here. Here is the gauge. As you can see, the gauge is showing me this is the current value right here. It's doing it for we're seeing now the tag called CDT 158. Its current value is 122. Now, we've automatically taken the 0 in the span and used that for the high and low, and we've just used some arbitrary numbers to split the range here by color. But that's something that you can control yourself, that you have control over. Now, as you would guess, just about everything on here is configurable. So if, as I said, we default to the values from the database for the 0 and the span for the top, bottom, and top, but you can change that if you prefer. You can also change these zones. You can change the tick marks, the number of tick marks. You can change the angle that we use. You can change whether we see this or not. So we'll take a look now at some of those, how to add this in the configuration options. Next, let's discuss how you can configure this WebPart. As you can see, this WebPart doesn't have any data yet. We're going to be discussing that a little bit later on. But first, let's discuss how you would configure the look and feel of this WebPart. We'll discuss that first, and then next we'll discuss how to configure this with a data source. Now I'm going to go into the upper right hand corner of that WebPart and choose from the drop down list there Modify Shared WebPart. You'll notice a form appears. On this form we can control how the gauge looks. Now, as I said, a little bit later on we'll come back and we'll take a look at how you would hook this up to a data source. Before we do that, let's take a look at some of these things that are just for to change the presentation. For example, we have something called base angle. Base angle allows you to choose the angle that you see down here in the gauge. We also have something called a scale factor. Normally your scale factor is going to be 1. That's a multiplier that you're going to be multiplying the actual data value by, so that it will appear on the gauge using that current value times the scale factor. As you can see, there's other things like changing the number format, changing what happens if you see bad data, and other things like that. So let's move on. I'll scroll this down. And as you can see here, you have some control over the minimum and maximum scale. So of course minimum and maximum scale is simply changing what we see over here. The number of zones in this case is 3. That's the 3 zones that you see right here. We get to choose how many zones. We get to choose what the ranges are of those zones. So if you look down here, as you choose each zone, you can choose what range you give to that particular zone. Okay, I'll go ahead and scroll down. As you can see, there's where you can set the percentages that you would use for those zones, individual zones. Now let's enhance the appearance now. I'll go ahead and collapse this and enhance the appearance. With appearance, we get to choose what the title is. In this case, I'm just going to call this My Gauge. You can choose whether the WebPart is going to auto size to fit the zone or to specify a certain number of pixels. Just so you know, if you do decide to adjust this to fit the zone, as you add more parts to that zone, then this is going to automatically resize to accommodate the number of parts you put in. And as you can see, you can choose things like the style of the frame. Generally things you're going to leave alone or leave the defaults. Let's look at layout now. I'll go ahead and click on this. Scroll down. We get to choose, for example, if you've got many things on different or within different zones, different web parts, you can decide for this particular web part which zone it's in. And if you do have more than one web part in a zone, you can choose the order in which this web part is going to appear in that within that zone. The direction has to do with, well, basically if you're doing a horizontal zone, you get to choose left to right or right to left, and that will have impact as well if you've got a vertical zone. And finally, let's take a look at advanced. Within advanced, there's Again, some bells and whistles. Do we want to allow people to minimize it, to close it, etc.? You can put in a different description if you want. If you have a different location to a help file link, you can put that as well. But generally things that you're not going to change. Now once I'm finished with this, I can go ahead and apply and say OK, and my changes will show up. Now here's the resulting configuration. As I said earlier, it doesn't have any data configured on it right now. So the next step is to go in and associate this with a PI tag. I'll go again to the drop-down list, choose Modify Shared WebPart. And this time I'm going to go to that first element, or the first section where we define the data source. This is the field right here for the data source, because this could be a PI tag, or we do have other things, other types of data sets we can retrieve from. In this case, I'm going to use a single PI tag called CDT158. Now I can do a tag search for that if I like. Go ahead and choose tag search. As you can see, I can type in the name of the tag, do a search, or there's other criteria I can search for as well. Now let me move this down. I'm sorry, I think we didn't see that. Yeah, if you take a look here, we can see that in this dialog box we have the option to see more criteria, and so I could search for this by point class or point source or any of the normal things you'd look for in a PI tag. I'll simply use the words CDT or the letter CDT. I'll choose search. And let me bring this back down again. I'll go ahead and select that and say OK. And now we've placed this tag name in here. Now I could have easily just typed this in by hand. I could just type this in using the convention that you see here, / server name / and then the tag name, and that would have had the same effect. Now of course we can change the interval of time we'd like to see. In this case we're going to go back 2 hours. We can change the look and feel of this. As I said, we can change whether it shows bad data as red or something else. We can change the scale. In this case it's using database. By database that means it's going to go out to the PI server, the point database, retrieve what the 0 and the span are for this particular tag, and then make use of the 0 and span to come up with what we're using over here as our start and end for this particular gauge. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of changes to this. I'd like to go ahead and change this base angle to 100. And as I said before, the base angle, that has control over what we see over here, so you should notice that'll make a change there. I'll go ahead and change that. And I think we're about ready to go. When I'm all finished with this, I can go ahead and click on the apply button. You can barely see that down at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead and say apply, or just choose OK. And what it'll do is it'll make these changes. As you can see now, I have a result that shows me the name of the tag. Here's the name of the tag. We've retrieved the current value, which is right here. The top and bottom of the range we've picked up from the point database. That's why we see 50 to 250. And of course here is the current value. Current value is right there, and that's going to change as time goes on. So there's an example of a gauge WebPart configured to point to a specific PI tag.